Hey, who's this?
You're the one calling me.
I'm Beth's father. I'm looking for Beth. Is she there?
Shit, this ain't even my phone.
Paul, who works as a mechanic, is on a video call with his daughter, Beth, checking in on how school is going. Beth appears tense and distracted throughout the conversation, though she insists everything is fine. At one point, Paul hears a man in the background angrily swearing at her, but Beth quickly brushes it off and claims it's nothing serious. Though uneasy, Paul doesn't press further. They talk about her coming home after finals and end the call on that note. The following morning, Paul collects the mail and is alarmed to find a letter from Beth's college stating that her tuition hasn't been paid for quite some time. Worried, he immediately calls her, hoping for an explanation. Instead, a strange man answers her phone. When Paul asks to speak with Beth, the man laughs mockingly and hangs up. Repeated attempts to call back go unanswered. Growing increasingly anxious, Paul leaves Beth a voicemail, pleading for her to return his call. He contacts the school directly and learns that Beth hasn't been staying in her dorm room. It's reportedly been empty for a while. Rather than notifying the police, Paul decides to handle the situation himself. He boards a flight to her city to investigate in person. When he arrives at her apartment and gets no response at the door, he forces his way inside. The place appears deserted, as if no one has lived there in weeks. While searching, he finds a photograph of Beth with another young woman, whom he assumes is a friend. With no other leads, Paul goes to a nearby bar popular with college students and shows the bartender the photo, but she doesn't recognize either girl. Paul decides to remain at the bar a little longer. After some time, he spots the young woman from the photograph walking in with a date. He approaches her immediately, introducing himself as Beth's father and asking about his daughter. The woman refuses to cooperate and avoids answering his questions. When Paul continues pressing her, a few men at the bar step in, leading to a brief scuffle. Seeing the situation escalating, the young woman agrees to talk, but only if Paul buys her something to eat. Over food, she introduces herself as Angela. At first, she dodges his questions, clearly hesitant to get involved. However, Paul's persistence eventually wears her down. She admits that Beth met a man named Eddie in New Orleans and ended up mixed up with the wrong crowd. Without hesitation, Paul offers Angela $500 to take him to Eddie immediately. The next morning, they hit the road together. Along the way, Angela questions why Paul hasn't gone to the police. Paul explains that authorities typically wait 48 hours before treating someone as officially missing, and he doesn't have time to waste. After stopping for gas, they continue on and eventually arrive in New Orleans at the place where Angela first met Eddie. Paul cautions Angela to keep her distance once they find him, hinting that he himself has a reputation in the city. He enters the building first, which turns out to be a nightclub. Meanwhile, Angela heads to the restroom where she takes drugs before making her way onto the dance floor. Instead of identifying Eddie as promised, she begins dancing provocatively for Paul, trying to turn the night into a party. Frustrated and focused solely on finding Beth, Paul walks back outside. Angela then notices one of Eddie's associates nearby. Paul approaches the man and demands to know where Eddie is. The man refuses to cooperate, and he and his friends jump Paul, knocking him to the ground. As they turn to leave, Paul suddenly rises and brutally overpowers all three of them. After beating them down, he grabs one of their phones and returns to the car. Angela sits there stunned, shaken by the violence she just witnessed. Using the phone he took from the attackers, Paul instructs Angela to send Eddie a message, pretending it's from one of his associates. Afterward, they check into a cheap, run-down motel to wait for a response. Angela, still unsettled by what she witnessed at the club, begins questioning Paul. She points out how easily he handled those men, how he refuses to involve the police, and how he chose a motel that doesn't ask questions. She demands to know who he really is. Paul avoids answering and simply tells her to get some sleep. Alone with his thoughts, Paul becomes overwhelmed with worry about Beth's safety. He heads to the bathroom to clean up. While he's washing up, Angela catches sight of his back. There's a large eagle tattoo stretching across it, and his body is covered in old bullet wounds. She also notices a tattoo bearing his wife's name and learns that she passed away from leukemia. The hardened exterior he carries begins to make more sense. Eventually, Eddie replies to the text revealing he's at a nearby club. Paul and Angela head there, and once inside, Angela discreetly identifies Eddie. Paul hands her the money he promised and tells her to leave. He then walks inside alone, immediately drawing the attention of a man who clearly recognizes him. Paul finds Eddie and confronts him about Beth. Eddie claims he doesn't know her, and even begins speaking disrespectfully about her. Paul calmly warns him to watch his words. At that moment, an older man approaches and introduces himself as Stuart, Eddie's uncle. Stuart quickly apologizes on Eddie's behalf and asks Paul not to harm him. It becomes clear that Stuart knows exactly who Paul is. Stuart reveals that years ago he was part of an 8-man crew that Paul single-handedly took down. Somehow, Paul had spared Stuart's life. As Paul, who has only been drinking water up to this point, takes a sip of alcohol, he remarks that back then he used to drink heavily. The tension in the room thickens as Eddie realizes just how dangerous the man standing in front of him truly is. Finally, Eddie admits that he used to date Beth. He explains that she eventually became involved with a drug dealer known as the Pharmacy. Reluctantly, he provides Paul with the dealer's location. Before leaving, Paul coldly tells Stuart that the only reason he survived that night years ago was because Paul ran out of ammunition. Then he walks out of the club, where he finds Angela still waiting. The two leave together. As Paul and Angela drive away, two armed men begin tailing their car. The thugs call a powerful local crime boss named Omar, confirming that they have Paul in sight. Omar orders them to capture Paul alive and bring him in. His right-hand man, Mark, advises against it and suggests letting Paul go, but Omar refuses. He wants revenge. The men start firing at Paul's vehicle and attempt to force him off the road. A high-speed chase erupts through the streets, but Paul skillfully maneuvers the car and ultimately causes the pursuers to crash instead. He drags one of the surviving men from the wreckage and demands answers. The thug admits that Omar sent them. Paul instructs him to deliver a message. Omar should stay out of his way. Without hesitation, Paul then executes the wounded driver, lying helpless nearby. They return to the motel where Angela is visibly shaken by what she has just seen. She confronts Paul, demanding the truth. Realizing he can't keep everything hidden any longer, Paul finally opens up. He explains that he was born and raised in this city before joining the military. After his service ended, he became a contract killer working for Omar. Over time, the growing bloodshed made him question his allegiance. In a flashback, we see Omar happily sending his daughter off on her first day of school. That morning, Omar's wife unexpectedly took his car instead. Moments later, the vehicle exploded. Paul had planted the bomb, intending it for Omar, but the wrong person paid the price. He witnessed the aftermath himself. Now, Paul understands that Omar will stop at nothing to get revenge, and targeting Beth would be the perfect way to hurt him. Realizing Angela could also become collateral damage, Paul contacts an old associate and arranges for her to stay somewhere safe. He then brings her to a large hotel to meet his longtime friend, Sam. Paul asks Sam about the pharmacy, and learns that the dealer is unstable and extremely dangerous. Despite knowing that helping Paul could draw unwanted attention and put him at risk, Sam agrees to assist him, for old time's sake. After Paul steps away, Angela asks Sam whether he plans to send backup to help him. Sam calmly tells her that Paul doesn't need assistance. He explains that Paul is far more dangerous than he appears. Years ago, he controlled an entire territory in New Orleans and was known on the streets as the Prince. Sam warns Angela that getting close to a man like Paul could only bring trouble. Meanwhile, Paul visits a local gun shop. He shows the shop owner a tattoo on his hand, but instead of welcoming him, the man immediately points a gun at him. The owner explains that his father once told him about men who carry that particular mark, and that they are not to be trusted. Paul reassures him that he and his father were allies, and that he simply wants to retrieve some equipment he left behind years ago. The owner leads him to a hidden stash in the back, but the weapons stored there are outdated and unusable. Instead, the man reluctantly hands Paul two of his own firearms. Armed and focused, Paul heads to confront the pharmacy. At the entrance, a guard confiscates his gun before escorting him through a building filled with addicts and chaos. Eventually, he is brought face to face with the dealer. Paul makes it clear that he's there to take Beth and that nothing will stop him. The pharmacy smugly replies that Beth is staying there by choice. He then reveals Beth in a nearby room, unconscious, clearly high, and heavily strung out. Paul rushes to her side, but at that moment, armed men surround him. They explain that Omar called ahead and ordered them to hold both Paul and Beth. Without warning, Paul reacts. He swiftly disarms one of the gunmen and unleashes deadly force, killing every armed man in the room. Grabbing Beth, he fights his way through the building, shooting anyone who stands in his path. During the escape, he is stabbed, but he pushes through the fatal pain without slowing down. He finally reaches the car, places Beth inside, and speeds away from the scene. Later, Mark arrives at a building where a man lies dying. He questions the man about Paul, but the wounded man is unable to provide any useful information, and Mark kills him on the spot. Meanwhile, Paul returns to Sam's hotel to tend to his injuries. Sam tells him that merely mentioning his name has already stirred trouble on the streets, which is why preparing their getaway car is taking longer than expected. Mark, having received intelligence that Paul is at the hotel, informs Omar, who immediately mobilizes all his forces. Paul goes to check on Beth. She's ashamed and hesitant about returning home, but Paul reassures her, telling her that his love for her hasn't changed, no matter what's happened. Outside, a convoy of cars pulls up to the hotel. Mark and his men quickly disembark, surrounding the building. Realizing he can't protect both Beth and Angela at the same time, Paul ensures Angela is sent away first. Once Mark's forces take their positions, he gives the order, and the men outside open fire on Paul and Sam. The two fight back fiercely, taking down several attackers. However, while they are engaged with the men outside, Mark uses the distraction to kill Sam's remaining men inside and seizes Beth. Hearing the gunfire from inside, Paul and Sam rush in, but gunfire pins them down. They manage to neutralize the shooter and give chase. A high-speed shootout ensues, but Mark manages to escape with Beth despite their efforts. Afterward, Paul and Sam realize that Angela's driver has been killed during the chaos. They quickly retrieve her and head back to the gun shop, where the owner provides Paul with powerful, high-caliber rifles in preparation for what's to come. Mark drags Beth before Omar, who tries to speak to her about her father, but Beth is going through severe withdrawal and is only focused on going home. She can barely respond as Omar presses his questions. Moments later, Paul arrives at Omar's headquarters fully armed and prepared for battle. Without hesitation, he storms the building, unleashing a torrent of gunfire and taking down every man he encounters. Omar learns of the attack, grabs a weapon, and holds Beth hostage, intending to use her as leverage. Paul, a one-man army with unmatched combat skills, systematically clears every floor of the building. Eventually, he confronts Omar, who has a gun pressed against Beth's head. Paul offers him a chance to live, only if he releases Beth. Omar demands to know why Paul killed members of his family and threatens Beth's life in retaliation. Paul coldly replies that those deaths were collateral damage, but Omar remains determined to harm her and retreats. Immediately after, Mark attacks Paul, engaging him in hand-to-hand combat. Using his martial arts, Mark initially gains the upper hand, but Paul quickly counters, throwing him off and drawing a gun to shoot him dead. Omar steps back into the fray, still holding Beth at gunpoint, seeking revenge. In a decisive move, Beth elbows Omar in the stomach. Paul seizes the opportunity and shoots Omar, killing him instantly. Beth rushes into her father's arms, noticing that he has been wounded. She helps him stand and get outside safely. Angela arrives and embraces them, and together, the three of them leave the scene, finally reunited and alive.